The lamb cost $1 at the Comanche County sheep auction on a Wednesday morning in March of 1934. And the reason it cost $1 was that it was blind in the left eye, and the man selling it wanted it gone before the truck left for Dodge City. Ruth Calder had come for fence wire pricing and a look at the wool lots, not for a lamb, and certainly not for a lamb that stood crooked in the pen with its head tilted to keep the good eye forward, the left one cloudy and useless, milk white where it should have been dark. The other bidders had looked at it once and moved on. A blind lamb in a hard year was a mouth to feed and nothing more, and 1,934 was already the hardest year Comanche County had seen, with the topsoil going east in brown clouds and the wheat not worth the diesel to cut it. Ruth looked at the lamb longer than the other bidders had. She was not looking at the eye. She was looking at the fleece, which even at 6 weeks had a tight, silvery curl unlike any lamb she had raised or seen raised in this county, a coat that moved like water when the animal shifted its weight, dense and glossy and curled so close to the body it looked almost woven rather than grown. She raised her hand at $1. Nobody raised against her. She was 24 years old and had been running her father's 160 acres alone for 11 months, since the pneumonia that started as dust cough had taken him in April of the year before. She had 18 head of mixed sheep, a used truck with a bad clutch, and a household account that had $11 in it before she spent one of them on a blind lamb nobody else wanted. She had also spent the better part of the winter reading, because reading was the one thing that cost nothing, and the county library in Coldwater had a full shelf on sheep breeds that nobody had opened since the librarian cataloged it. She had read about Karakul sheep specifically, a Central Asian breed imported to the United States in small numbers since 1908 for a single purpose: the tightly curled, silk-lustrous pelt of the newborn lamb, sold in the fur trade as Persian lamb or astrakhan, a pelt that commanded prices no domestic wool could touch because the entire supply had always come from Bukhara, and the fur houses of New York and Chicago were desperate for anything that could replace it now that the Central Asian trade routes were choked by war and revolution. She had never expected to see one in a Kansas sale pen. She had certainly never expected to buy one for $1 because it was blind. Before we find out what Ruth does with a blind lamb nobody else wanted, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all across the country, and we love knowing where these stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. New stories every week. She named the lamb Bishop for the dark, priestly curl of its coat, and she carried him home in a feed sack on the truck's bench seat because he was too unsteady on his feet to trust in the bed. She built him a small pen inside the main barn, close to the stove flue where the heat came through the wall, and she bottle-fed him twice a day for the first 2 weeks because the ewe that had rejected him had also gone dry from the stress of a hard lambing. Karakul lambs were born with the tight curl already formed, unlike ordinary wool breeds whose fleece developed gradually over months. The curl was there from birth, or it was not there at all, and it began to relax and loosen within days as the lamb grew, which was why the fur trade took its pelts within the first 3 days of life. Ruth had no intention of pelting Bishop. She intended to keep him alive and breed him, because a blind ram lamb could still sire, and the genetics did not care what his left eye could see. Daniel Osgood came to the fence on the following Saturday. He farmed the section to the north, wheat and a small herd of Herefords he was slowly selling down as the drought worsened, and he had been coming to that stretch of fence with some regularity since the previous autumn, on the pretext of a shared section of drainage ditch that ran along the property line and needed clearing before spring runoff. The ditch had been clear since November. They both knew it. He was tall, sun-weathered past his years, with brown eyes that had a way of settling on a thing and staying there until he understood it. And he had the particular quiet of a man raised by a father who considered unnecessary talk a form of dishonesty. "Heard you bought a blind lamb," he said. "I did," Ruth said. "$1," he said. "$1," she said. He looked past her at the barn, where Bishop's pen was visible through the open door, the lamb standing at the rail with his head tilted, watching the yard with his good eye. "Karakul," Daniel said, which surprised her, because she had not told anyone the breed name yet, only that the coat was unusual. "My uncle raised a few outside of Wichita before the war. Persian lamb pelts. He used to say the coat was worth more than the meat, more than the wool, more than anything else that came off a sheep. He was quiet a moment. He also said they were hard to find good breeding stock for, this far from where the fur houses were buying. "He's blind in one eye," Ruth said. "Nobody else wanted him." "Doesn't need two eyes to breed," Daniel said, and something in the way he said it, flat and practical and already 3 steps ahead of the conversation, told her he had already done the arithmetic she had spent the drive home doing herself. Bishop grew the way Karakul lambs grew, which was to say the newborn curl loosened within the first 2 weeks into a looser, wavier adult fleece, coarser than the pelt quality coat had been at birth, but still distinctive. Still nothing like the Rambouillet and Hampshire crosses that made up the rest of Ruth's flock. He was healthy despite the eye, sturdy on his legs by the 3rd week, moving through the pen with the confident, deliberate gait of an animal that had learned to compensate for a blind side by keeping his head turned. By May, he was weaned and out on pasture with the rest of the flock, grazing with an appetite that outpaced the other lambs his age, which Ruth noted in the ledger she kept for the farm's records, a habit she had inherited from her father, who had written down everything and trusted memory for nothing. She wrote to a wool broker in Wichita in April, describing the breed and asking what the market looked like for Karakul stock, both live animals and pelts. The reply came 3 weeks later from a man named Ellis Fenwick, who ran a small fur and wool brokerage that had been struggling since 1930 to source Persian lamb pelts at any price, because the Bukhara trade had effectively collapsed and the handful of American Karakul flocks, mostly experimental stock from the Bureau of Animal Industry's importation program decades earlier, were scattered and poorly documented. He wrote that if she could establish a breeding flock and produce pelts to the standard the trade required, tightly curled, taken within the first 3 days, properly cured, he could place every pelt she produced with fur houses in Chicago and New York, and that the price for first-quality Persian lamb ran between $8 and $15 per pelt, depending on curl tightness and color, against a wool fleece from an ordinary sheep that brought perhaps 30 or 40 cents in the same season. Ruth read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she did the arithmetic she had been circling since March. $1 lamb, if he sired even a modest number of ewes, and the curl held true in the offspring, could produce pelts worth 10 to 15 times what her entire flock's wool clip brought in a normal year. She understood immediately that this changed the entire logic of the farm, and she understood something else just as clearly. The pelting trade required taking lambs within 3 days of birth, before the curl relaxed, which meant this was not an operation that could run alongside a wool flock in any simple way. She would need to decide, animal by animal, which lambs were pelted for the fur trade and which were kept to build the breeding flock, because a flock that pelted every lamb would never grow, and a flock that kept every lamb would never produce income. She wrote this down in the ledger as a rule and did not revisit it as a question again. Breeding ewes and the herd ram were never sold and never pelted. Only a portion of each year's lamb crop, beyond what was needed to grow the flock, went to Fenwick's buyers. She needed ewes. Bishop alone was not a flock. She had 18 sheep already, none of them Karakul, and crossing Bishop onto ordinary ewes would produce lambs with some curl characteristics, but not the pure, tight Astrakhan curl the fur trade paid the highest prices for. She wrote to the Bureau of Animal Industry's experiment station, which had imported the original Karakul breeding stock in 1908 and 1909, and dispersed some of the offspring to interested breeders over the following decades. The reply, slower this time, took 6 weeks and named 3 breeders still active with documented Karakul stock, one of them in Texas, close enough that a trip was possible if the truck's clutch held and the money could be found. The county's opinion of Ruth Calder's blind lamb had been forming since March with the particular thoroughness Comanche County brought to any decision it considered unwise. Hollis Prager at the feed store told her plainly that she had paid $1 for a sheep that couldn't see a coyote coming from its blind side, and that half a flock was better than a flock with one eye missing from its best ram. He said this to her twice, a week apart, in case she had missed the wisdom of it the first time, and she thanked him both times with the specific courtesy she had learned to extend to opinions she did not intend to act on. Della Marsh at the church supper mentioned, not quite to Ruth's face but close enough to be heard, that grief did strange things to a young woman running a farm alone, and that a dollar lamb with a bad eye was exactly the kind of thing a person bought when they had stopped thinking clearly about money. Daniel did not say any of this. He came to the fence on Thursdays now, without pretending the ditch needed attention, and he asked about the lamb's growth and the letters from Fenwick and the Texas breeder, and by June he had stopped asking questions shaped like conversation starters and started asking questions shaped like a man doing arithmetic alongside her. "If the Texas ewes cost what you think they'll cost," he said one Thursday, leaning on the rail with his hat pushed back, "you won't have enough left for the trip and the ewes both." "I know," Ruth said. "I've got $40 I'm not using on anything urgent," he said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, already having decided it before he opened his mouth, leaving her the choice rather than the persuasion. "I'm not taking your money, Daniel." "Didn't say give," he said loan. "There's a difference, and you know it, and I know you know it, which is why I said it that way." He looked at Bishop grazing in the near pasture, the loosened adult fleece catching the June light with a sheen the rest of the flock didn't have. "I'm not telling you what to do with the flock. I've got no interest in running your operation for you. I've got an interest in seeing whether a dollar lamb turns into what I think it's going to turn into, and I'd rather be part of finding out than standing at this fence wondering." She took the loan in writing, with an interest rate she insisted on and he thought was unnecessary, and she thought was the only way she could accept it at all. She drove to Texas in July with the truck's clutch complaining the whole distance and came back with 4 Karakul ewes in the bed. Documented stock from the Bureau's original importation line, purchased for $31 from a breeder who had been keeping the flock more out of stubbornness than profit and was glad to see them go to someone who understood what she was buying. The 4 ewes bred to Bishop that autumn, and the first Karakul lambs of Ruth's own breeding arrived in the last week of January 1935, in weather that required her to sleep in the barn for the better part of 2 weeks to keep newborns from freezing in a cold that dropped past 0 most nights. She lost none of them, which she credited to nothing more mysterious than not sleeping and checking the barn every 2 hours through the worst of it, the way her father had taught her a lambing season was managed. 6 lambs came from the 4 ewes, 3 of them showing the tight, glossy curl at the standard the fur trade wanted, the other 3 looser and less distinctive. Still valuable as breeding stock to grow the flock, but not pelt quality. She kept 2 of the 3 pelt quality lambs' mothers back for breeding the following year, and sent 1 pelt, taken according to the exact protocol Fenwick had described, cured and packed with the care of a woman handling something she had waited 11 months to see, to Wichita in February. Fenwick's payment came back in March, $11 for a single pelt, more than the entire wool clip from 4 ordinary ewes in a normal year. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the check in her hand for a long moment before she did anything else, the way she had sat with Fenwick's first letter the previous spring, doing the arithmetic that mattered less each time because it had already told her everything she needed to know and was now simply confirming it. By the spring of 1936, the flock numbered 22 Karakul sheep, built from Bishop and the 4 Texas ewes, and 2 seasons of careful, documented breeding that Ruth recorded in a ledger she now kept with the same attention her father had given the wheat accounts. She had learned to identify curl quality in a newborn lamb within hours of birth, the density and tightness that separated a top pelt from a merely good one, and she had learned which of her ewes threw the tightest curl consistently, information no book had contained and that she had built entirely from her own records. She sold 8 pelts that spring to Fenwick's buyers, at prices that had climbed to $13 apiece as word spread among the Chicago fur houses that a documented American Karakul flock was producing reliable quality, and she kept 14 animals back to grow the breeding flock further, exactly as the rule in her ledger required. The math was no longer theoretical. 8 pelts at an average of $12 was $96 from a single lambing season, against a wool clip from her original 8T sheep that had brought perhaps $40 in a good year before the drought made even that uncertain. Word reached the county the way word always reached Comanche County, through the feed store and the church suppers and the particular efficiency of people who noticed trucks on the road and mentioned them at counters. Hollis Prager stopped mentioning the dollar lamb's bad eye sometime in the spring of 1936, around the time a buyer from a Kansas City fur house drove out personally to look at the flock and left with an order for the entire following season's pelt quality lambs, sight unseen, based on Fenwick's reputation and a single sample pelt Ruth had sent along with her letter. Della Marsh began asking, with what Ruth understood to be genuine curiosity rather than the earlier concern, how a person went about identifying which lambs would carry the tight curl before they were even born. Daniel had stopped calling it a loan sometime around the second payment, which Ruth had insisted on making anyway, on schedule, with the interest, because she had told him in July of the previous year that there was a difference between a loan and a gift, and she intended to prove she had meant it. He came to the fence on Thursday still, though the ditch excuse had long since been abandoned entirely, and neither of them pretended otherwise. And by the summer of 1936, he had started coming on Tuesdays as well, ostensibly to help with the lambing records, but more accurately because the two of them had discovered that working through a ledger together at her kitchen table was a way of spending an evening that neither of them had a better use for. "The Kansas City order," he said one Tuesday in June, looking at the figures she had worked out for the coming season. "That's more lambs than Bishop and the 4U's offspring can produce on their own." "I know," Ruth said. "I need another ram, unrelated bloodline, so I'm not breeding brother to sister 3 generations running. There's a breeder in Nebraska with bureau stock going back to the same 1909 importation. Different line." "Another trip," he said. "Another trip," she said. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he'd already decided something and was working out how to say it without making it sound like a decision he'd made for her rather than with her. "I'll drive you," he said finally. "Not lending money this time, driving. There's a difference, and you know it, and I know you know it, which is why I'm saying it that way." She looked at him across the table, at the brown eyes that had been settling on things and staying there since the previous October, at the man who had loaned her $40 against a blind lamb because he wanted to be part of finding out what it would become rather than stand at a fence wondering, and who had never once, in 14 months of Thursdays and then Tuesdays, told her what to do with an operation that was entirely her own. "All right," she said. They drove to Nebraska in August, the wheat stubble gone gold and brittle on both sides of the road, the particular late summer light that made even a hard year's landscape look like something worth staying for. Ruth bought the second ram, a 2-year-old with a curl her Nebraska sellers swore was as tight as any he'd produced in a decade of careful breeding, for a price the Kansas City order made easy to justify. Daniel loaded him into the trailer without being asked twice, the same way he had shown up with the right tools whenever something on her place needed doing, and never waited to be told it was his business. By the following spring, the flock numbered 31 animals, 2 unrelated ram lines established. The breeding program documented well enough that the Bureau of Animal Industry's regional office had written asking whether Ruth would be willing to have her flock included in their ongoing survey of American Karakul bloodlines, an inclusion that Fenwick told her, with some satisfaction, would make her pelts worth still more once buyers understood the documentation behind them. She had cleared $412 from pelt sales in 2 seasons, against a farm that had cleared perhaps $90 total in the year before Bishop arrived in a feed sack on the bench seat of her truck. She had paid back Daniel's $40 with interest in the spring of 1936, and he had taken the check without argument. The way a man takes something he understands is not really about the money. Bishop himself, blind in the left eye and unbothered by it, grazed the near pasture through his 4th spring with the particular unhurried confidence of a ram who had sired most of the flock standing around him and had no reason to doubt his situation. Ruth stood at the fence some evenings and watched him, the loose adult curl catching the last of the light, and thought about the dollar bid nobody had raised against, and about a county that had stopped mentioning the eye sometime in the 2nd year. Not because anyone had apologized, but because the ledger had made the argument better than any conversation could have. Daniel came to the door now, not the fence, most evenings that his own place didn't need him, and on a Tuesday in September, with the harvest wheat in and the second season's pelt orders confirmed and the flock's 3rd ram line under negotiation with a breeder in Colorado, he sat across from her at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them and said the things she had been waiting a year and a half to hear him say plainly, rather than sideways through loans and driving and Thursdays that had become Tuesdays. "I've been thinking the North 40 would sit better as part of one operation than 2, he said. yours and mine, if that's something you'd consider." She looked at him, at the ledger, at the window where Bishop was visible in the last light, grazing with the flock he had built from $1 and a bad eye. "Come to supper Saturday," she said, "and bring the survey plat. If we're going to talk about combining anything, I want to see the numbers before I answer." The corner of his mouth did something it had been doing more often since Tuesdays became a habit. "Saturday," he said. She sat at the table after he left, the ledger still open to the season's figures. The household account no longer the $11 it had been the March a blind lamb stood crooked in a sale pen, with nobody bidding against her. Her father had never said much about unusual things, but she remembered him saying once, watching a hailstorm flatten a field he'd expected to harvest, that the ground always told you what it was worth eventually, if you were patient enough to wait for the weather to turn. She had bought a lamb nobody wanted because she had read the right book in a cold winter with nothing else to do, and the weather, in its own slow way, had turned.